Yeah, guys, we want to take some time during this lockdown to kind of chat about some issues that have come up. And tonight, what we want to talk about is help. How do I share my faith? I think if you're a Christian and if you're watching, sharing your faith may be a bit of a challenge. It might be something that doesn't come naturally, and maybe a bit of a hurdle for you. So we just want to chat openly about what that might look like, maybe some insights and some helpful things to remember. So why don't we kick off, Rat? If you're ready, let's kick off with probably the most obvious question, and that's what is the biggest obstacle when it comes to sharing your faith with other people?
Thanks for that, George. And just before we dive into that, if you guys do want to ask questions or leave some comments, WhatsApp myself or George directly, and we can hopefully try and answer your questions if you've got any. But yeah, the biggest obstacles, George, there are a lot of obstacles. It's a big topic, and there's a lot of obstacles when it comes to sharing your faith. But for myself, I suppose the one that always pops up is the fear factor of you're scared you're going to mess it up. You're worried your mates are gonna reject you. You don't want to. There's an embarrassment factor. You don't want to be. There you at work, for example, and you decide you're going to share the gospel with someone, and you share the gospel with them, and they laugh at you, and then you have to work with them for the rest of the time. So it's that kind of. There's all those kind of anticipatory fears that you have, and
Sure.
so there's a lot of actually. I wouldn't say there's one thing, but it's scary. It just is for everybody.
Yeah, I think in one sense, a lot of us never really feel ready. There's this thing like you've got to jump through a few hoops, or you've got to qualify in some way in order to go out and say something, because, like you say, you don't want to mess it up.
Yeah.
So would you say that you're ever ready?
Yeah, George, it's a good question. I was actually listening to a blog post on this, and the lady on the blog post was saying, she said, you're always ready and you're never ready. And what she was explaining was you're never ready in the sense that you never have all the answers.
Sure.
None of us do. Opportunities can jump in your face and you're not ready for the opportunity. And so there's a lot of factors where if we wait to be ready, where we can articulate things as clear as we'd like them to, we've got the answers to people's questions. If we're going to wait for that moment, I'm not ready as a pastor, because I don't have it all. I have often had to say, someone has asked, and I'm like, I actually don't know. I'm not too sure the answer to that. And I've had to say, I'll try to get back to it. I've never thought of that, or I actually don't know the answer to that. So in one sense, we're never ready. But then in the same breath, if you know Jesus and you've met Jesus through the scriptures in prayer, and you're a follower of Christ and you love him, and then you are ready because you've got Jesus, you've got him, and that's wonderful. And you've got Jesus, so you're ready to do what our Lord wants us to do. So you're never ready and you're ready. And it's scary.
Yeah, I think that's kind of liberating, the fact that if we've met Jesus, if we are following him, that's all we need to do. That's all we need to know. And I think the element of our personal story, our personal testimony comes in there. What role would you say your personal journey to faith plays in sharing your faith?
That's George, the thing that I'd want to say to everyone watching and thinking through this topic of sharing your faith is there's this kind of, I don't know if it's a view or a perception that you need to have this very well articulated, well rehearsed argument for Christianity, the proof of God, and like an answer to why does God allow suffering, the answer to other religions, and the reliability to the Bible, and have all these answers, and while those things can be helpful, it's intimidating. But I think what we see in the Bible is we want to share the gospel, which is the news about Jesus. And the best way to share the gospel is to share with other people about how you experienced Jesus, how you met Jesus. And so your testimony can speak loads to people because you're not trying to argue with them. You're not even trying to convince them, even though we want to convince people. You're just telling them this is what happened to me. I know that I've in my evangelism that I've done is I often use my story. And even if it's I grew up in a Christian home, and this works and makes sense, and Jesus seems lovely. He seems lovely and beautiful. Why would I want anything else?
Sure.
So there's starting. I mean, there's a lot more to say on that, but that's if you've got your personal story about Jesus and how you trusted him and turned to him, that's great gospel stuff. That's great evangelism. The word that people sometimes use. Yeah.
Cool. And I mean, you mentioned in the beginning one of the obstacles being, you might work with this person that you want to share your story with, or maybe it's someone in your family. And there's that relational hurdle. There's that relational aspect that you really want to stay friends with this person. Maybe it's a mate, that you've known from school for 30 years.
Yeah.
But you really want to tell them something, but there's that hurdle of, I don't want to, throw this friendship away.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
It's so difficult. When I became a Christian, I was living in a commune in London, and I was very zealous when I became a Christian. I'd love to return to being a bit more zealous, I think, in that regard. But I was just like, if it had a heartbeat, actually that was optional. I would tell them about Jesus, and I probably went about it in the wrong way, in many regards. But I had all these friends, and there was this fear of what are they going to think of me? But I was so overwhelmed by the love of Christ, and I was so overwhelmed that they needed to hear this wonderful news that I just gave it a go in my brokenness. And I lost some friends. Some friends appreciated it. One or two people became Christians. But there was I even had a close friend who was an atheist, and after me becoming a Christian, she stopped being an atheist. She became she wasn't an atheist. She was quite a spiritual person. Sorry, my mistake. She became an atheist because I became a Christian, and she used to send me all this really hectic anti-Christian stuff, and it was hurtful, And that's the cost. It's hard, But here's the thing: is you'd also be surprised. Then sometimes you take a chance. I remember I was working for a company in London, and I spoke to a guy, and I was so nervous in speaking to him about Jesus. And I spoke to him, and he was like, I'm interested. I'll do that course. And there the guy goes along and does a course, becomes a Christian. You just don't know, and that's God's business. We just kind of give it a go. Are we willing to lose friends? I did lose some friends, but in my experience after that, people just accept you're a Christian, and you can continue the relationships with them as well. And you have opportunities to speak to them as you go. And it can be grindy. That's what we sign up for, but it's scary. People often say, George, I don't have the gifts of evangelism. I can't speak about Jesus to anyone. And then sometimes that can be true. I think we all can say something. The Bible does talk about us being able to be ready to give an answer for the hope we have. But sometimes we think that if you're an evangelist and you've got that gift, every time you speak the gospel, people are just going to go, oh, I believe Jesus, no, evangelists in history get rejected all the time. People, George Whitefield, one of the greatest evangelists, in the Great Awakening. I mean, people weed on him and threw poo at him. You know what I mean? He was rejected properly. But many people became Christians through him. And he was happy to, well, I don't know if he was happy in the moment to
take the rough with the smooth.
Take the rough with the smooth, yeah. And it's like, so, George, I think one of the things that I'd want to say to folk as well is like, in all this fear and this apprehension of wanting to speak about our faith, I think it actually, the question just returns to our relationship with Jesus and the joy we have with him. And the more we are, kind of getting to know Jesus more and involved in enjoying him, I think the more we'll want to, I think the easier evangelism becomes, if you can talk about it easy in that sense. It just becomes like something that you want to share,
Sure.
Yeah. I don't know if that's helpful, but
I think, I don't know about the people listening, but for me, I always like to have thought through things before I speak. And you mentioned, the arguments for different religions and scientific stuff, that sort of stuff. That for me personally is a hurdle. I want to have my ducks in a row when it comes to having thought through that stuff. What role should, apologetics is the technical term for that sort of stuff. What role does that play in sharing your faith? Is it something we need to know lots about?
I think there's a discussion that needs to be had revolving around the gospel and apologetics and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with apologetics. There's great discussions to be had around some of that stuff, science and Christianity and other religions and all those kind of things. And there's discussions to be had there. Obviously, not everybody's equipped for that. But the important thing to know, and I think this is where the beauty of the comfort and the joy of evangelism or sharing your faith comes in, is like apologetics is not going to change anyone's heart. It can be a step to a conversation about Jesus, but the Bible is clear. Romans 1 talks about, it's the gospel that is the power for salvation. It is the message about Jesus and who he is and what he has done that God uses to unveil people, to penetrate their hard hearts and to open their hearts so that they can see Jesus. 2 Corinthians 3 and 4 in that area there, just talks about the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, and Paul talks about it. You need the gospel message that God uses to shine a light like in creation and to open up their hearts so that they can be unveiled, he talks about. So they can see Jesus and go, wow, that's amazing. And so it's talking about Jesus that God uses. And notice what I just said there. Not that you just speak about Jesus as best you can. And God uses that. He's the one who changes people's hearts. You can't change anyone's heart. And so to the question about apologetics is they can be helpful discussions, I think, and they can draw people into a discussion about Jesus. But until you get to Jesus, a discussion about science is not going to convert anybody. And we need to be careful about that. And also, and this is a bugbear of mine, I think where there is an overemphasis on apologetics, what it does is it causes fear and guilt in the ordinary Christian who doesn't not everyone is into apologetics, understands the science Christianity debate. I'm not a scientist. I don't understand science, but I can tell you about Jesus, because he has spoken to me through his word. And I can tell you that he loves you. And I can tell you that your greatest problem is your sin, and he died for that, and that heaven waits, and that he will walk with you now in joy. And that we all can talk about Jesus, So I think apologetics can put a lot of Christians off about sharing their faith. And when people are sharing their faith, you'll often hear things like this, like, Brad, I was having this conversation with someone at work, and they said, oh, but what about the Big Bang? Or what about this? And what about that? And I think it is absolutely right to go, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I just don't know. But what I do know is that Jesus came as God on earth and showed himself to be God on earth and died for my sins. I can tell you about that. I can talk about it with love, that kind of thing. So there's a place for it. But it's not the be and end all, and it's not the heart of evangelism. It actually isn't evangelism until you get to Jesus. It isn't sharing your faith until you get to Jesus.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Erat. And I think also you've got to pay attention to your context. So I think maybe on a university campus where people are really into asking those sort of questions, and maybe has more of a place.
Yeah, definitely.
But I mean, you've lived in Belize longer than me. But I think as I read our context here, those aren't the biggest questions in our context here. People have questions about kids, raising children, marriage, jobs. Those are the sort of things that are boiling up, in a suburban place. And how do we live? How do we do life well like that? And so I think again to
Lots of
emphasize.
opportunity for the gospel there. You know,
Absolutely.
I mean, it's like, there's an opportunity to talk about Jesus everywhere. You know, parenting, marriage. You know, often people talk about marriage, and I'm like going, well, you know, I'm pretty useless at marriage, and I'm really thankful that Jesus has come into my life to forgive me for me being a rubbish parent and a rubbish husband, and he's helping me to be a better one. You know, and that leads on to the gospel about Jesus who died for me, and a Jesus who's coming again to judge the world, and I want to be with him and safe and want to know
Sure.
God. You know, so it is, but it is scary. It is. I mean, I'd like to say that my bent is evangelism. You know, sharing Jesus with people. I've backed down many times in fear of embarrassment. You know, and it's just it's what it is. But the opportunities are there, and we can talk about Jesus. You know, and
Yeah,
God uses
absolutely.
ordinary Christians to do that. You know, so.
Yeah, and I think if you're listening in, be encouraged by that. Be encouraged by the fact that we live in a place where we can integrate our faith and our lives quite freely and easily. And yeah, trust God to take a step.
Yeah, he's the one who converts people, not us. You know, George,
Absolutely.
as you're saying that, the thing that just struck me as I'm sitting here thinking is, you know, God has decided in his sovereign, in his economy, however you want to talk about it, how he's decided to rule this world and to do his thing. He's decided that to fulfill his plan of saving a people from hell, for heaven, for himself, for eternity, he's decided to do that through us, by us holding out the gospel message to others. Now, if I was God, which I'm not, it's like I would never give the gospel to me to do that because I know what I'm like. But God actually goes, you know what? You're my people. In your broken way, share the gospel with people. I don't want to sound irreverent and say the wrong thing here, but it's like it's almost as if God trusts us with the gospel. You know, he wouldn't give us the job to do evangelism if he didn't think we, you know, could do it. You know, so
Yeah.
I'm encouraged by that. Now we've also got God on our side. You know, he's the one it's his mission. We just mouthpieces.
Sure.
Yeah.
And be encouraged. If you feel like a fool, that's okay, because as Paul reminds us in the beginning of Corinthians, you know, that it's the foolish things. God uses the foolish things to reveal truth to people. You know,
No, totally.
He humbles the wise.
Yeah.
So if you feel like a fool, don't worry.
I can tell you a little quick story of encouragement. So when I became a Christian, one of the people that I forgive me if you've heard this, but like I wrote a letter to my dad, to my mom, to my stepdad, like everyone I knew got a gospel conversation with me, because I was overwhelmed by the reality that when you die and your life ends, or when Jesus returns, the only thing that matters is you're going to stand before Jesus, and all that matters is whether you have trusted in him or not. All the other things in life are it's not that they're unimportant, they're unimportant at that point. And so I wrote a letter to my dad and to blah blah, and I told my dad, and I probably was unhelpful in my evangelism with my dad, and he was angry with me, and we went back and forth for years, and we chatted and blah blah blah. Long story. Anyway, I was in London, he was in Austria. I evangelized him every argument I had, every apologetic, every argument I had, and he was like, nah, don't believe it. And I was so frustrated. I thought I was pretty clever in my arguments, and I thought I could outwit him, and you know, and he was like, nah. And then he moved back to South Africa, and he was sick and stuff, and blah blah blah. And he would come down on holiday to Ballito to spend time with us. And we'd sit on the couch outside, and I would evangelize, and we would talk, and I got nowhere. And I was just so like disappointed in myself, as if the power was in me. And I was really bleak. But this is what happened. One day we're sitting on the couch. This is about 3.5 years ago now, 4 years, I don't know. And we're sitting there, and my dad sees this butterfly land on this flower, I think it was. And he looked at it, and he was like, oh my hat, there must be a creator. Look at the intricacy of that flower. My dad's an artist, was, you know, and that butterfly. And suddenly he had this whole epiphany about creation. And he was like going, and if there is a God like that, then this Jesus stuff. And he was like, and he became a Christian. And it was to do with none of my arguments. None of my arguments, Yes, he had heard about Jesus through me and God had used that. But it wasn't my clever arguments or anything like that. He saw a butterfly and then he connected Jesus to being the creator and he became a Christian. And I was like so stoked, but I was also like bleak. I was like, I wish he had become a Christian through my clever argument. I was waiting for I didn't think about that. I'll become a Christian. You know what I mean? But he did. And we've got a beautiful God, and we just, if we keep on loving people and sharing the faith with tears, not ramming it down their throats, just finding opportunities to talk about Jesus to our friends and family, God uses that and he converts people. He just does. That's what God's in the business of doing.
It's a great reminder of how it is the Spirit's work and not our work.
Oh, totally. It's so liberating. It is so liberating, George. And when we get that, it doesn't take away from the fear factor and that kind of stuff. And I always kind of want to go back to that just to encourage people that it's not only you who have those fears and everything. But if you see Jesus as beautiful, you're going to give it a go.
Right, man. I just want to pick up on something you mentioned once or twice there. Was you said a few times, maybe it was the wrong time or maybe it was unhelpful. Would you say that there's a wrong time to share the gospel or an unhelpful time? What would you say to that?
Listen, you can be unhelpful. There is unhelpful stuff. So I think if you self-righteously are trying to ram the gospel down your mate's throat, your family's throat, they don't hear anything. You're doing something that's generally speaking, they don't hear you because they're just angry that you're shoving. So it can be unhelpful, but God can even use that. But you know what? God in his economy, he's so much bigger than us. And he loves his mission more than we love his mission. And he will use people have become Christians under weird circumstances. And you know what? Sometimes that's okay. It's not an excuse for us to think we mustn't think through how best to love people with the gospel. We must articulate and try and be and be as best we can. So it's no excuse for being a chop. But God, you just got to give it. You got to step into the arena. Now, not everybody can, in the sense of fear. Some people. So I don't hear this as other rats saying we must all now go and knock on doors. There's so many different ways of approaching this. Being involved as a church. And so can you be unhelpful? Yes, but God can use that as well. But you don't know until you give it a go. I kicked myself so many times. I've shared the gospel with some people. Sometimes I've plucked up the courage and I've made a complete mess of inviting someone to come to church, or like example to our online Sundays. I've sent it to all my friends, come and join us, and I've expected none of them to come. I've bumbled my words. I've been unhelpful. And there 2 or 3 people rock up and they're like, hey, Rad, I really enjoyed it. I want to hear more. I'm thinking, if I was you, I wouldn't want to hear more. I bumbled. I messed. I'm like, that. But the messy honesty, I don't know, God uses, it's like, it's God's big, eh?
And you mentioned the church there. So, I mean, we, the people of God, are the church, but the local church also plays a role. So what would you say is the relationship between the local church and how we, the people, the church, can share our faith? As you mentioned, taking a friend to a course back in your early days in London.
That's right. So George, if I hear what you're saying is, there's a couple of things to say on that. The first thing to say on that is that the mission of taking the gospel to the world is the church's mission. We've been talking quite individualistically here, which is fine and great, and that's a responsibility that we all kind of should put on ourselves, not to make ourselves feel guilty or way too much pressure, but it is the kind of thing that Jesus has given us. But he's given it to the church as the primary vehicle for reaching the world. And so it's when the church acts as the church and takes the gospel to people that we have the mission taking place. So let me just give you an example. I was quite struck. I was listening to that podcast I was telling you about where the one presenter was quite animated and surprised by the fact that Jesus says, this is how you'll know who my disciples are. Not that you're loving the world, but that you're loving each other. Now, of course, we want to love the world, but it's quite interesting. How does the world see us as Jesus' disciples, which is a kind of like a, hey, okay, opening doors and gospel kind of in action kind of stuff. And it's as we're loving each other. So as the church loves each other, people see that and it attracts them. It becomes an attraction to see loving Christians. And throughout history, you see that happening. Why are the Christians picking up the babies? Why are the Christians loving each other so much and looking after, that kind of questions. That's one thing. Then the other thing is just being involved in the gospel enterprise. When someone's making tea at church and they've got in their mind, okay, I'm going to make tea so that the welcomer, we get lots of visitors at Christchurch North Coast, they can feel welcome. That's part of the whole mission. When we're giving money to see the gospel go out, when we're planning a church in Shire Moya, it's the unified body of Christ who are together going, Jesus has given us a job. It's wartime in that regard. Let's use the gifts that we all have together. You go and fetch them. I'll do a talk. That does this. You make coffee. Let's get together and get excited, and see people converted. I get excited about this.
That's awesome. And then in terms of, at Christchurch North Coast in particular, is there something that, obviously people can invite their mates to church on a Sunday? Is there anything else in particular that we try and push people to?
Yeah, George, I think
as a tool.
Yes, as a tool. So, we do this. Let me say it this way. We've had a lot of visitors and we've had a lot of people become Christians by coming to Christchurch North Coast over the years. And that's wonderful. We're going to continue doing that. There's a whole section of our community in Belito who will never step into a church. So we've got to go to them somehow. And that's a different discussion. Yeah. But in between those two zones, we have things like the Rethink Jesus course, where people can come and sit in an environment and ask their questions and investigate Jesus for themselves. And we always run that course. It's had great. I don't want to use the word success. I don't like that word. It's seen great fruit. It's God has used that course, and I thank Him for it. We're going to run one after Easter, actually, online. How's that for scary? George, we can make it up. I used to do a thing called, when I became a Christian, the way I became a Christian, I know some of you heard this, and if you haven't heard this, you might find it awkward if you're a Christian, but I did a thing called JD's and Jesus. I wasn't a Christian, and this guy invited me to a pub. I drank Jack Daniels, and he told me about Jesus. And that's how I became a Christian. Now, that's not ideal, me drinking Jack Daniels, but I wasn't a Christian. But the guy was like, I'm never going to get to speak to this guy about the gospel except there in the pub. And then I became a Christian through that, So I know that might be, that might raise a lot of questions for some of our viewers. But, Paul says, I'll become all things to all men so I can see some saved, and it's like, we need to get creative, If we've got the gospel in our hearts and in our lives, with Christ with us, and we're enjoying Him, and we're going, actually, this is what other people need to hear, And it's more than, it's not less than, there's obviously, the heart of it is the virus of our sin that needs to be forgiven so we can have a relationship with God. But it's the relationship with God that is so beautiful that we want other people to have. It's not just, don't hear me wrong as I say this, there's the urgency of people are going to hell without Jesus. They need Jesus. But in the same breath, they're missing out on a beautiful relationship with God that they can have. It's a double whammy. It's like, be saved and enjoy God and eternity and each other and the blessings of the gospel. So,
yeah, I think when you've really experienced Christian community flourishing, you just want to pull everyone into that thing. Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, I get excited like this now. Go and watch me when I'm on the street, when I'm talking to people, down at the beach. Just give me fear factor, I'm such a wimp.
So you mentioned the virus of of our sin, and that's obviously our big problem. But virus is the buzzword at the moment with the coronavirus going on, and this is why we're locked up and live online now. Why, in the context of a lockdown with so many different things that we can talk about, why did we prioritize talking about sharing our faith in the middle of a worldwide pandemic?
George, thank you for asking that question, because I was actually going to just talk about that anyway, even if you didn't ask it. Because I think it's an important question. So, and folks, it's very easy in this pandemic environment to be distracted. There are things that we should be distracted by, but not totally distracted by. So let me clarify that. So we are, for example, thinking about how we can take care of those who haven't got food, love those made in the image of God. If the crisis hits, like Shire, for example, and we want to take food in there and information, and we want to help out, and that's great. But that can become a distraction. It's a good thing we should be doing, but it can be a distraction from what matters. Because you know what? People who survive the coronavirus are still going to have to stand before Jesus. And I said it a little bit earlier, my conviction and my shock in this whole, you sit at home in this lockdown, you're like, trying to figure things out. And it depends on what your personality is like. My mind goes nuts. I need to go and, dive and surf it. I need to do energy related stuff to keep my brain at ease, And so here I'm thinking through stuff a lot, and it's like, which is actually good for me. And I'm just thinking, oh my hat, the thing that matters the most is people are perishing and going to hell. It's like, I don't want to stand before Jesus on that day and have to explain to him why I just helped people be healthy. And there they are, filing into hell. I can't cope with that in my emotions for a whole lot of reasons, but it's just the gospel is the most important thing. And so we want to love people. That's the character of the church, to love people and feed them and all that kind of stuff. But the mission of the church is the gospel. It's what matters more than anything else. And as soon as we're convinced of that, the more we will share, we will have that urgency to share our faith with other people. It's just, I don't know how to even explain that. I don't know how to explain it, but it's just like, when I became a Christian, I told all my friends and my dad and everything, I just couldn't cope. I was just like, I know God's God and everything, and he's sovereign. He can do what he wants. But I was like, I've got to go and tell my dad. I've got to go and tell my mom. I've got to just try. And they all rejected me at one stage. My mom rejected me and died. My dad rejected me, but then became a Christian, and then he died at Christmas. You guys, And I was like, it's just urgent. But here's the thing: the coronavirus does two things. For me, anyway. It helps me remember the urgency, what matters. The gospel really matters. And secondly, it reminds me of the opportunity. So the opportunity that the coronavirus, I've had so many conversations that I would have never had before. You're going to see me do something funny now. Dexter, shush! The dog's barking. The coronavirus has given me so many opportunities to talk about Jesus. I'm loving it in that sense. And I'm going to say something really grindy here. I've noticed that the coronavirus has really helped Christians to search their own hearts about what matters in life, Jesus or not. What's important in life. I'm hearing, as a pastor, you hear all the struggles Christians are having. And the other thing that it is raised in that is the need for people to hear the gospel. And if that's the case, if Jesus is using the coronavirus to mature his people and get them to worship him more and turn from their idols, and causes more people to become Christians, I'm like, I don't mean this the wrong way, but then I'm like, I'm thankful for the coronavirus. Now, you know what I mean when I say that. I'm not, of course, it's a devastating thing, and I'm not thankful for it in that sense, but I'm thankful that God is using it to awaken Christians to the realities that really matter. In peacetime, when everything's lacquer and it's like, and your mind is consumed about your next marathon, and your mind is consumed about your dog and feeding the dog, and your mind is consumed about your work and everything like that. Now suddenly those things are all there and they're important. They're not unimportant, but now suddenly it's like, oh my hat, the gospel,
Sure.
So I'm excited.
Yeah, I think another thing it's doing is just kind of ties into what you're saying. It's reminding us of our human frailty. I think that's a big one for me.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you listening have read the book *Sapiens*. It did the rounds kind of recently. It was very popular.
It's very well written.
Brilliantly written. I loved reading it. But what struck me so much about that book is the confidence in humanity and the almost arrogance of how we will. I mean, his next book is Homo Deus, God man, and how humanity is becoming their own God, and we will basically defeat, sickness, and we're going to live for, however long, and all this stuff. And it's just really brought home the frailty of humanity and how we aren't in control. And I think, I know I'm chatting to friends that have lots of family in Italy and across Europe, and they are like, out there it is chaos. People are terrified of going outside because they know they could catch this thing and be gone. So
yeah, it is, and that element, it's good for us to, the Bible says, number your days aright. The Bible calls you to, I read it on in the sermon on Sunday that Ecclesiastes 7, rather go to a funeral than a party, because we're all destined to die and we should take heart of that. And it's a weird verse. It's like, I'm not going to a funeral over a party, but the sentiment is right. It is right for us to look at ourselves realistically. And it's not a morbid conversation. People get very like, oh no, that's so morbid. It's a realistic conversation. And then when you get to the gospel, it doesn't become a morbid conversation. It becomes an exciting discussion. I've got Jesus. It's awesome. My dog's just going to bark the whole evening. I don't know if you can hear him.
He's doing doggy evangelism.
Yeah, he's barking at oh, goodness me. I'm hoping my wife will come out and settle the dog. George. So I'm just having a look here if there's
just JL laughing at us because of the dog.
Yes, yeah, cool. Guys, I just wanted to just say, as we're doing this, I don't know if anyone's even watching. It's so awkward. This is not George and I's sweet spot. I don't think I'm just looking at a picture of George on the screen. That's really awkward. But I just want to say, guys, we should be rejoicing. We should be overwhelmed in a good sense that we are loved by God. It's nothing that I'm not sitting here saying these things as if I deserve to be saved by Jesus. I'm not sitting here as if I had special knowledge, or I just heard about Jesus and God saved me, and I'm so thankful for that. And I think if I can have that gratitude in my heart, I think it will spill over to just have conversations with people around me. They don't have to be well articulated. They're just conversations, and let's see what God does with those things. He's big. He's beautiful. Yeah.
Cool, folks. Well, thanks so much for tuning in, and I really hope you drew something useful from that discussion. We were a bit all over the show, but yeah, we're just enjoying grappling with these issues. So yeah, come along for the ride with us. We don't know how long we'll be locked up for yet, so keep joining us, and yeah, I hope you can be encouraged to take a step and trust God to share your faith going forward. But great to have you, and we'll catch you soon. Peace out.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. Catch you later. It was great to be involved in this. George and I, from time to time, will try and do kind of crazy things like this. And if no one's watching, at least George and I will benefit. But because it feels weird. Catch you guys later. Cheers.